We're a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa, bringing together faculty members, students, and then seasoned and emerging leaders outside of the university around issues at the intersection of science, society, and policy. And so for us, that frequently means three themes. So science for policy, so evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making, policies for science, technology, and innovation, and governance of emerging technologies. We are in the fourth year of a 5-year strategic plan, and our strategic vision is to help Canada meet the grand challenges of our time by helping to strengthen relationships and collaboration across the science, society, policy interface. So that's among academics, public sector, the private sector, Indigenous organizations, and other members of civil society. So Confluences is a very central component of our strategic plan. L'événement aujourd'hui va avoir lieu en anglais, et si jamais vous avez des questions ou des interventions en français, soyez-vous bien à l'aise d'être dans la langue de votre choix. On est un institut bilingue, alors soyez-vous bien à l'aise d'intervenir en français. We'll begin today with the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. So I'm going to share a little bit more with you about Confluence's Grand Challenge Action Dialogue. So, you know, as we know, there are many grand challenges facing society, from climate change to global pandemics, inequality, and all of these challenges require solutions at the intersection of science, society, and policy. Cutting-edge research is being conducted in this space at the ISSP, both within and outside of the organization here at the university. But there's untapped opportunity to co-produce and mobilize this knowledge for decision makers. So last year, we launched Confluences, which combines the co-creation of an edited volume, which you're going to be hearing about more today. That's what brings us together for this action dialogue, and an annual knowledge mobilization series, which I'll speak about here in a moment. To date, we've been just so pleased with the level of traction that we've gotten with Confluences, high levels of traction, particularly with science policymakers, with early career researchers, and thought leaders from a variety of sectors. And so this year, we decided to broaden and deepen the engagement work with Confluences by launching the Grand Challenge Action Dialogue. So this incorporates more direct engagement with seasoned and emerging leaders. And I'm so glad to look around this room and see both seasoned and emerging leaders. That's very much the aim. And really to broaden that mobilization of knowledge at the science, society, and policy interface. So today, as you can see from the slide here, today is our second action dialogue. We're convening a series of 4 dialogues over the course of this year. In October, we brought people together around Beyond Endless Frontiers, which is a project at the Institute about rethinking the science-society relationship. So that dialogue explored the findings of an ISSP-led SSHRC partnership development grant that seeks to build a new relationship between science and society that reflects our times. A number of you here today and online, I assume, we're also in attendance at that dialogue. We had a tremendous conversation that included themes like building public trust, advancing inclusive innovation, considering Indigenous knowledge, and mission-directed research. Today, we're coming together around the theme of confronting disruption. And so we will be exploring with contributing authors to the first Confluences edited volume, how to address issues at the intersection of science, policy, and society. We'll hear more about that in a moment. In January, we'll have our third action dialogue on equity, diversity, and inclusion in post-secondary research. So this is a dialogue we're really pleased to collaborate with the Council of Canadian Academies on. The council, as some of you might know, recently published an expert assessment on EDI in post-secondary research. So we'll be mobilizing that work and convening with other internal and external partners around the theme of EDI in post-secondary research. And then our final dialogue for the year will take place in February on the topic of science diplomacy in an increasingly fragmented and uncertain geopolitical world. This will be undertaken, we're really excited about this one, in collaboration with ISSP core member, Professor Patrick Fafard. For those who know Patrick, you will know that he is the new University of Ottawa Embassy of France Research Chair in Science Diplomacy. And so that dialogue will be examining the interface between science, diplomacy, and foreign policy. So each action dialogue, and you'll see this in action today, consists of a publicly accessible interactive engagement with guest speakers, speaking to a key grand challenge and related research and practice to address it successfully. So very open. We've got, as people know today, a hybrid session, so people in the room, people online. That will be followed then, or is followed by a by-invitation discussion with seasoned and emerging leaders across multiple sectors to provide a neutral forum for an off-the-record deep dive into the grand challenge to generate new insights, new programs, new practices, and to identify areas for collaboration among academics and practitioners. And core to this, from the ISSP's perspective, is to provide meaningful opportunities for graduate students and early career researchers to participate in the sessions, whether as speakers, as attendees, or undertaking student-run sessions with our guest speakers. So again, you're going to see that in action today. So our agenda for today, you see it up on the screen now. I've just completed the welcome. I'm going to be handing things over in a moment to your moderator for today, Jeff Kinder. We'll have an opportunity to hear from our speakers. We've got a number of discussants lined up to provide some thoughts, an open discussion, and then a wrap up by 1:15 at the latest. So without further ado, I am so pleased to hand things over to your host for today, Dr. Jeffrey Kinder. Jeff is our inaugural executive in residence at the Institute, and he spends a day of his week with us at the Institute. The remainder of his time is as a project director at the Council of Canadian Academies. So Jeff, I don't know how you accomplish as much as you do in a day a week. I'm quite sure it's more than a day. We're very grateful for your contributions. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I have to say I'm looking forward to the holidays and having fun. But it's been a really productive fall, and so happy to be here. All right, so welcome everyone. Happy to have you here. We are going to hear from our speakers in just a moment, but I thought I would spend a few minutes just kind of giving a little bit more on the Confluences initiative, and particularly the volume that we're working on and that these authors are contributing to. So we'll just go to the next slide. Monica has already covered a lot of this. I just wanted to focus on that third bullet, where we have adopted this notion of the pracademic, which is the idea of bringing together practitioners and academics to engage on these topics of obviously global importance, policy relevance, but also interest academically. And so I think, you know, the people in the room today, the people who are joining us online, kind of reflect that idea of people who have kind of a foot in both the academic and the policy or practitioner world, and are interested in you know, sort of building that bridge between those two communities, and then of course all within the context of the broader society, which I'll say that you know, 2 weeks ago we had the Canadian Science Policy Conference, which is obviously by its very nature very key in terms of connecting science and policy, but I had never heard so much attention paid to the broader society in that forum, and I think so it reflects, I think, a growing recognition that yes, we need to bring science and policy together, but we need to do so as well with the broader public. And so obviously at ISSP, that's where our focus is, that intersection or the confluence, if you will, of science, policy, and I think there's a growing momentum in that direction, which is encouraging. Let's just go to the next slide if we could, Yasmina. So as Monica mentioned, we are working on a book. This is one of the key products of the Confluences initiative. We have a really stellar lineup of authors who are contributing to that. Many of you are here today. Just an update on that, we're a little behind the original schedule that we had anticipated for that, but we're getting things back on track. And we expect that that will be released in the new year. We're excited then to make that a regular feature of the ISSP. The vision of the volume is that it is an edited volume. We have a number of authors contributing on various themes at that interface of science and value policy. The volume will also include an analysis of recent developments in the SSP space. Assuming a federal budget happens this year, we will provide a bit of an analysis on that, through an SSP lens. And we have committed to make it available in a digital open access format. So that it can be obviously accessible as widely as possible. Go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense, there are many chapters, and this list does not cover all of them. But you will be hearing from our guest speakers here today on these first two about robotics, and from Sarah on brain drain and broader issues that she's working on at Evidence for Democracy. But just to give you a sense of some of the other chapters in the book, we've got authors from Canada Foundation for Innovation, looking at the environmental impacts of our research infrastructure, our major research facilities. We've got authors from the Canadian Museum of Nature, who are looking at how we might better leverage the biological collections, specimens, and data to inform policy decisions on biodiversity. Cheryl, who's here with us today, is contributing a chapter around AI algorithms and intellectual properties. Obviously a timely topic and a growing concern. Others, Kim Gerling from the Public Health Agency is contributing a chapter around mis and disinformation, and on, including we are very pleased to be able to say that we have a chapter that is an interview with Ted Hewitt, who is the president of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, among many other chapters. So I think it's going to be a really timely and interesting volume, and look forward to getting it out in the new year. Got to get through peer review and a few more steps, but we'll get there shortly. Let's just go to the next slide, and then I just also want to acknowledge that we have put together an advisory group that's advising us on the Confluences initiative. Many of you are here today, others weren't able to join us, but are here in spirit. So just a huge thank you to all of our members of the advisory group. You can see that it's a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral group, very much in line with the spirit of Confluences as a academic initiative. So with that, let me say thank you again for being here, and let me introduce our speakers. So we are going to hear from two speakers and then two discussants. And then, as Monica said, we'll open it up for general discussion. I am going to give first preference to questions that are coming from the participants online, just because we'll have additional time to talk within the room later in the session. Okay, so let me introduce first of all Mark Robbins. Mark is with National Defense. He and I are former colleagues at the Institute on Governance. He then spent some time at the Innovation Hub or Innovation Lab at the Transport Canada, and is a rising star, I would say, in the area of innovation policy. So we'll hear from Mark, and then we'll hear from Sarah Laframboise, who is leading the Evidence for Democracy, and was a huge influence and lead of the Support Our Science campaign. And was the founding head of the Ottawa Science Policy Network, which is the basically the student organization on campus that is focused on science policy. So Sarah will hear from Sarah on, like I said, brain drain and other issues that you're working on. And then we will hear from two discussants. First of all, Tara Laframboise, who is the Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement and Advancement of Society at SHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council. And then Bryce Bogey, who is our graduate fellow at the Institute and MD PhD candidate in neuroscience here at the University of Ottawa. And someone who gives me great confidence in the next generation and the future of the world. So thank you, Bryce. All right, no pressure. Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jeff, and thanks everyone for being here today. So I'm responsible for the paper Rules for Robots. And there's a lot that I wanted to cover in the amount of time today, but I'm not going to be able to get to all of it. So I want to start by just hand waving through two big issues, and if you'd like to discuss them more, we can do that in the second period, or you can read the article. The first is, what is a robot? And my definition is, we know when we see it, these are all robots. They do robot things. I also want to mention all of these examples here are real robots that actually are being used. They're not concept art. All the examples I've selected are robots that I've seen or used myself. So there's always a little bit of a tech flight of fancy that exists out there. This is tangible material. The second thing I wanted to wave my hand through was about the trend line. And let me just say, trust me, there's going to be a lot more of these things. There's some really aggressive projections out there about how many, but I think the evidence is quite clear that we can expect to see tons and tons more of these in circulation, to the hundreds of millions to low billions. So robots, by definition, move around. And I think that that definition is important because if your definition was a bit wider, then like, why is my laptop not a robot, or like a security camera not a robot? Right, so at a minimum threshold, they move. Not only do they literally move, they also figuratively move. They move jurisdiction. They move jurisdiction quite frequently. Essentially, whenever they are going from one place to another, you might actually stumble into a different authority of relevance or a different governance stovepipe. I'll give you a few tangible examples. So this one here, this is a robotics company that basically said, hey, moving robots around is actually really challenging. Let's skip that part. Let's attach the robot to a human mule. The human will mule the robot around or perform automatic diagnostics and engineering assessments. Because this robot is attached to a person, it falls under consumer protection legislation. The business case for this robot is identical. The tech stack is very similar. The governing legislation is civil aviation. For this robot, the governing standard is labor standards regulation. And this one, it's the Warehouse Receipts Act. It's actually in freight forwarding place. It's not just these four examples. I would say there's a few dozen different ways that you can slice the domain of robotics and put them into a different governance stovepipe. In political science, we refer to this as fracturing, right? So you have one discrete subject matter that is fractured into many different places that are responsible for this in one measure or another. This degree of fracturing injects a ton of uncertainty into the domain, particularly when it comes to things like statistics, like how big is the sector? When you have 30 different places all collecting information on it with different definitions of their own. How about forecasts for the sector? Same problem. And then naturally, of course, governance. You have many different approaches to how governance should take place, which are obviously not coordinated with one another. It ends up being a bit of a mess. You don't have to take my word for it, though. I'm going to provide you through a real world example. When at Transport Canada, we took a look at this robot here. This is a snow plowing robot designed to plow sidewalks. And we wanted to deploy it in an environment like this, on a street to plow sidewalks. So the first bit of this was easy. It was our robot, and we were the federal government, we were Transport Canada. And so we said, we will approve ourselves to use our own robot. Great, 50% of the way there. Then we got to the actual deployment area, which is the other half of the problem. And the governance kind of look like this. So the sidewalks are municipal, but the intersections are provincial. But municipalities don't view themselves as being a single jurisdiction, not really. On the left there, we're playing in Ottawa. This is a map of downtown Ottawa by regulatory jurisdiction. If you want that robot going through a park, you're going through a different governance structure, different department, like different everything, compared to a parking lot, compared to a historic district. Naturally, there's other ways that fractures, so it got down to a really complicated committee structure. Is that robot going to potentially interact with someone who's walking on the sidewalk? Well, that is going to go to one of several different committees, depending on who you're talking about. Like, is that person able-bodied? That's one series of committees. Do they have disability? That's another committee. Province had the same sort of fracturing within itself and actually disagreed a lot with the city about who was responsible for what parts of it. The city also wanted to take other areas of responsibility to the province. They also wanted to kick some to the federal government, which again was fine. We just proved ourselves every time they said it was archers. But it became insane. We started working on this in early 2022. Myself and a colleague who I believe is on the line, Dr. Brian Callister. And I think I can say with a lot of confidence that if we continued on this trajectory in 2022, we would not be done today. So we said, screw it, we're not working with these things. What we're going to do is we're going to put it on federal lands because we are the federal government and we can improve ourselves on federal land. We did it on pasture instead. So if you ever want to learn more about this, it's on YouTube. You can just check it out, like Snowplow Robot, Government of Canada, something like that. You find it. The second thing I want to say is that this is not an odd situation. This is what it commonly looks like for robotics to be deployed in a public domain. If you are a company that is developing robotics in this space, and this is your pathway to commercialization, you really have two options. Stick it out in this forever and probably go bankrupt, or you swap to a private jurisdiction where there's a single point of authority that can give authorization. And of all the startups in Canada that have seen that work in this space, they have all done either of those two options about even order. About half have gone bankrupt or trying to go public, and the other half have gone to a private jurisdiction. So what does a private jurisdiction look like? We'll do the same little process. This is a Nightscope security robot used for security. And Nightscope wants to deploy, that's their device. They say, okay, well, we are going to do a manufacturer attestation saying that if something goes wrong, we're liable. And we'll get insurance. Device approved. For the location itself, Nightscope is principally in parking lots. They say, okay, well, the owner of the parking lot is going to state that they're going to assume some liability and then get insurance. You're good to go. I think very different than the first example. If you recall back to the first slide there, I showed you all sorts of images of cool robots. Every single one of these has been developed for a private location where there's a single governance split. And I think that tells us a lot about what's happening in the sector. I'll give you one other example. Let's say I want to approve this robot to be used. Well, same thing, manufacturer attestation and insurance. But then what about the space, right? Because airspace is a public commons. It is a public commons, it's complicated, but it has a single regulatory authority, which is civil aviation. Also, what it does is it takes approvals and it puts like the first 99% of approvals into a licensing regime. If you do this and that, then you are authorized to operate. You don't want to go into the nitpicky details of every single thing that happens. For the things that are not covered by licensing regimes, get insurance and maybe apply for a special permit if it's really sort of outside of the norm. You are also seeing an explosion in the use of drones, right? Like because that governance has been figured out. So what does this all mean? First, I think it's really easy to say that there's a significant deadweight loss associated with the current governance structure for robotics. The regulatory environment is distortionary, it makes it hard to operate. It pushes overdevelopment and overinvestment in the technology into areas where you have privately governed spaces where the governance is more simplified. And by consequence, it prevents progress and deployments in the public realm. Second point is that technology in this space is continuing to progress anyways. Like it's getting better and better irrespective of if we can figure out the governance or not. That means that the business case and the use case for public deployments continues to get better, and the incentives for non-compliance are also increasing steeply. So there's a solid governance risk that people are going to lose faith in the social compact because there are more and more reasons to deploy these things in less and less ways, compared to their relative terms to get them approved. Finally, I think technology can actually help, and I get into this in a lot more detail in the paper. Technology offers new pathways for being able to govern these spaces in ways that have not been conceivable 5 or 10 years ago. Things like providing comprehensive geofencing that allows the devices to operate, but also sets automatic boundaries for how they operate within the public domain. Basically, I think that the only way for us to really solve this new technological disruption is by ourselves adopting a bit more technology in terms of how we approach it. I'm going to stop there for now, just to make sure we've got time for your questions. But thanks for your kind attention and happy to engage with you.
Thanks, Mark. In fact, I was sitting in my office at the Council of Canadian Academies late yesterday, looking out my window towards City Hall and Confederation Park there. And I see this red light come floating in, and I thought, is that a plane that's flying way too low for a plane? And then I realized it's got to be a drone, right? And then it just stops and it hovers there, and it's just hovering there for like half an hour as I'm, continuing to work, looking outside occasionally and saying, yep, still there. And I'm thinking, okay, this is timely. We need to figure out this governance. All right, thank you, Mark. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I will speak from two hats today a little bit. When I contributed to this piece, I was still a graduate student here in Ottawa and taking an active lead in kind of advocacy for a lot of that work. And so at the end, I'll kind of have some probing, thought-provoking questions in my new position at Edmonton Democracy, just because I think they bleed together and are equally important to the theme of disruption. So to start with the work on brain drain, that is the chapter that we contributed to this work. I wanted to start by acknowledging the work of the Ottawa Science Policy Network, and specifically Thomas Bailey, who's a graduate student here at Ottawa in the Department of Physics. He really spearheaded the execution of the report itself, and the team, I think, is just a wonderful example of volunteer-led graduate student work going into research and peer-reviewed research. When I first started the Ottawa Science Policy Network, we were really eager graduate students to take an active role in the science policy space, and we were really trying to figure out what we could contribute to this space. And there's a lot of themes that we could have started working on, but we were a bit impartial to the theme of graduate student finances from the beginning. It was impacting our personal lives as well, and so we had started looking originally at a national graduate student survey across Canada, where we got 1,300 students to answer a survey on what their current stipends were in Canada. This was published under peer review, and is really a lot of the work that spearheaded the eventual Support Our Science campaign. So I transitioned into the role of executive director at Support Our Science almost 3 years ago now. And in all of the meetings that I would be in with elected officials, I was finding that the theme of brain drain was resonating with cross-partisan meetings. And so while the thoughts on graduate student finances were relevant and we were adding data to that conversation, the theme of brain drain seemed like the next step for us to try to figure out what that meant. And at the time, the data that mainly existed was alumni data from specific universities. So you could kind of get a sense of, regionally, where were people moving, or, from U of T or McGill, where were people going after graduation? Or you kind of saw other surveys that looked at specific industries, such as the tech industry or computer science, where, you have these giant kind of tech areas like Silicon Valley that are deliberately kind of pulling talent away. But there wasn't really a good capture of generalized graduate students and PhD graduates across the country. We, at the moment in meetings, would say that about 30% of graduate students, specifically PhDs, were moving on to other countries. And so we took that number at the time and were able to extrapolate training dollars that were put into those students. And we estimated that it was just under $1 billion that we were losing every year, just in lost training dollars into students who were leaving. And that fact resonated a lot, and specifically with conservative audiences that we were meeting with. The economic impact of that is something that Brain Drain could bring to that conversation. And so it was a really interesting kind of dichotomy there that we wanted to dive into more. So, you know, I want to preface also by saying that internationalization and international experience is not necessarily the problem here. I think we can look to our colleagues in Europe, for example, where students are very mobile. They are, you know, encouraged to experience international experiences and go and get graduate student experience or postdoc positions abroad and bring kind of that connections and experiences back to their universities. But specifically, Brain Drain here is the permanent of high quality talent. And I think that is what we see more of in Canada, because we don't have that culture of going to experience things as easily in other countries. And instead, we're actually seeing that permanent outflow of experts and expertise. And so I just want to make that distinction because I think it's important to recognize. Additionally, you know, in the 90s, we saw the creation of the Canada Research Chairs in Canada, which was at the time a government mechanism to combat brain drain and to pull highly educated and talented folks who had already left to come back and take on professor positions in Canada. And, you know, this became the landmark program for Canada and is recognized in other countries as a successful program to pull these back. But, you know, I think we're in almost 30 years later. Is it still working? Is it still doing what it was intended to do? And I think that's an important question. To get into the survey results, so we had about 600 responses. 411 of them were currently enrolled in graduate programs in Canada, whereas 171 had recently graduated from a Canadian university. 293 were PhDs, 116 were masters, and about 25% were international students. And so we kind of broke them up into those who were current graduate students and their intent to leave, and then those who had already left and why they had left. And so I'll talk about kind of those results here. On the intent to leave, of the students who are currently enrolled as a graduate student in Canada, 64% of them indicated that they were likely or very likely to leave the country. And 36% of recent graduates had already left, while another 15% were saying that they still had plans to leave. And so this was actually even higher than we were maybe anticipating when we were going into it. We were, again, kind of estimating that 30%. But so this was showing us that, you know, even if people don't actually leave, they want to. And so that led us to our next kind of probing questions about why they were leaving. What are the factors involved with the choice between leaving or staying? And so what was fascinating to see is that those who were more likely to leave Canada rated things like finances, prestige, infrastructure, and jobs as their top reason, whereas those who were likely to stay actually rated family and friends, significant others, workplace culture, mental health and well-being, and healthcare as higher priorities to them. And so, you know, you can kind of get a sense of why people are leaving is because they can probably get higher paying jobs. They have better access to higher infrastructure and better payment and things like this. But the ones who were staying were, it was harder for them to leave their families. They likely had a significant other, you know, especially PhD graduates are likely into their late 30s, early 30s. And, you know, this becomes a reality for making big life decisions like this is, where is my family? Where is my partner? Where can we start a family? These types of things. So we also saw differences in gender between those responses. And I think that's an interesting thing here as well, is that men were they're more likely to choose the financial option and leave, whereas women were more likely to choose family and friends and stay. And, you know, it just shows like cultural differences between that as well. And again, this is only a snapshot of the results. There is a version of this on the Ottawa Science Policy Network website if you're interested in getting kind of a preview of it, but it will be published fully in the book. What I think that it really shows though is a bit of the power between balance between quantitative data and qualitative data, because I think that anyone in this room probably has a story of someone who has left the country, and I know myself, I'm the only graduate student out of my lab that stayed in Canada, and I'm not in academia. And so, I think we all have examples and anecdotes of brain drain, but we didn't really have data to back it up, and especially the factors. You can often say, yeah, of course they're leaving for the money, or they're staying for family, but having the actual data to back up some of these was really powerful in these meetings. Brain drain definitely is a topic, like I said, that resonates with multiple political parties. And so being able to illustrate the economic burden and impact that could have is something that I think still resonates in this conversation now. If we look at the recent investment earlier this year in the budget, I think some have been tempted to say that this kind of solves the brain drain problem. I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic than that. I don't think that this really had an impact on the topic of brain drain. I think it made a difference for students who are able to get scholarships. And, we know that this isn't a large percentage of total graduate students in Canada. But even with the supporter science movement, we often got criticism that we were only advocating for the scholarships and fellowships. And I think that it's really important to note that, when you're doing an advocacy campaign, you have to be strategic and ask a single question when you're doing things like this. And so we always saw the scholarships as being the first straw to be pulled. The next is complicated because it's multi-jurisdictional. It involves provinces, federal government, it involves universities with central administration, department heads, it involves faculty. And so that was always a harder thing to change. The scholarships had a single person that we had to go in and ask for a change at. And so, I always encourage people when I'm doing talks on this, because I think that this really is going to involve systemic change, and it's going to require changes at all levels in order to actually increase funding for students across the board. And it's a harder thing to provide accountability for, because there's not really much accountability to do change other than goodwill. And, you can find really great allies in different departments who are willing to, propose this to their departments and things. But then again, you can have situations like similarly that we have at UOttawa, where we have differences in stipend values drastically between different departments. And this is because, advocacy could work in one department and it might not work in another. And so, it's very multifaceted, and I think that's maybe where I'll leave the brain drain conversation on. The last thing that I wanted to comment on, and I couldn't not comment on this with the topic of disruption. So I will apologize for maybe being more pessimistic and I'll talk a little more pointed than I normally would, because it's, townhouse rules, and I think it's an important conversation. But I think that, I'm overwhelmed right now with the level of politicization and polarization that we're seeing in research funding. I experienced this as a graduate student doing advocacy for graduate students. And I experience it now in my day job, where I work with researchers to try to get them to, take that active step into engaging with public policy. I think that this is a product of our current political landscape, but it's also a bit of a product of the disconnect that we're seeing between science, society, and policy more broadly. And we talked in the last session about how we've kind of lost the narrative with society. And this has such implications to policy. When you lose that relationship and that public demand, you lose political demand as well, because that is the other kind of advocacy route, right? You either go directly to policy, or you go to the public to mobilize community and engage in policy. And so I think what this has left is that we're seeing a lot of ideological biases coming out in the conversations surrounding science and research. And so we can look down south. We've already seen examples of President Trump, who has threatened things like kind of regulating any research funding to universities that have EDI programs, or that ideological lens that's being applied to research. And, we're also seeing this sentiment in Canada. Just last week, we had the Standing Committee for Science and Research convening on their new study on the evaluation of research excellence in Canada. And, two of the witnesses with Jeremy Kerr, who I'm not sure if he's joining online, but great job defending our industry. We had two witnesses who were extremely anti the integration of EDI in our merit-based kind of evaluation process. And so, when this starts to resonate with politicians, we get the politicization of something that is so fundamental to our research environment. And so, I saw similar sentiments when I myself appeared to the standing committee on their capstone project where, we started to see the listing of different SHRP grants, usually by their title, that are international or environment focused, and they list them and inherently are assuming that because of their titles, they disagree with their titles, they are inherently not meritful and not worth funding. And I think that this just ultimately leads to confusion between that interface. I mean, we can look to universities as, the pinnacle of where research typically happens in Canada. And we can see politicization of the role of universities right now. What we're seeing here is literally the integration of an ideological perspective into a research funding process, which are totally distinct sectors. And so, the entangling of those in the minds of politicians becomes really dangerous and could be weaponized. And so I think that's why I wanted to bring up this kind of aspect of this today, because I don't think we can talk about brain drain, graduate student funding, or any of this without talking about kind of the politicization of this process, especially in election years. So
Good, thank you, Sarah. Set us up for good discussion. Lots of very important issues there. Conscious of the time, I want to get to Tara and Bryce. So Tara, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Thank you for convening this activity and for allowing me to be a part of it. Thank you, Mark and Sarah, for your comments. There's a lot to unpack and chew on, and I'll try to be brief because I'd love to hear more about the conversation through the participants online and in the room. Maybe on behalf of SHRC, let me acknowledge the work of Sarah and her colleagues in Support Our Science and the important advocacy work to get a very significant increase in the federal budget, budget 24, not only significantly increased funding for graduate students and postdocs, but also committed $1 billion ongoing to the tri-agencies. And so we see the funding to students as being the first step, but know that within the ecosystem that there will be far more opportunities for both direct and indirect investments in students who are supporting research, as well as those who are leading it. I was really thinking a lot, Sarah, about the comments that you've made about knowledge mobilization, and certainly that's a big part of my role here at SHRC. I'm responsible for communications, Indigenous research strategy, and also our Imagining Canada's Future initiative. And so we're always looking at how can we be a better partner, not only to government, but to researchers and to civil society in making research-informed decisions. So we do that through a variety of our programs, and very selfishly, I'll just put a little plug in. We have a knowledge synthesis grant that is currently open for applications on envisioning governance systems that work. And as I was hearing Mark talk about robotics and all of the different governance systems and all of their complexity, I was thinking to myself, I'm sure when we put out that call, we were thinking more about digitization of government and opportunities and regulation of AI, but I can see how robotics would very quickly fall under that category as well. Anyway, for those who are interested, the deadline is coming up fast. It's December 12th. And then similarly, I think that just the other link is that we will have some other KSGs coming up in the next little while that please stay tuned. One is on the arts transformed, and later one on the changing nature of security and conflict. So things to be involved in, and of course, opportunities for graduate students and emerging researchers to participate in. Even more troubling in the news this week was New Zealand's decision that they are going to stop funding all social science and humanities research. Not only that their research, 50% of it needs to demonstrate fairly immediate economic impact, and they are doing away with peer assessment. We're also appearing before those SRSR committees on capstone, on research excellence and the criteria of excellence. We will defend the merit review process to the end. It's not a system that's without flaw, but it is the best and universally recognized. And so we will continue to bring that forward. I think I will leave my comments there at the moment. I think the other conversation that links maybe both Mark and Sarah's remarks and thought provocation is balancing, what is the private good and the public good? And we certainly believe that publicly funded research is in the public value, but we always need to reassert what that is. And so that's definitely a big part of our role, but it's actually part of all of our roles. And I think an important thing that this book and the ISSP platform do is to help bring forward the value of the research and the value of the contribution and helping to understand those links. All this to say, I think there's much more work to be done, but maybe I'll leave my remarks there.
Okay, good. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for the confidence for the Institute and our work. So Bryce, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Mark. It really made me think probably a lot. 5 minutes is going to go by fast. As Jeff mentioned at the beginning, so I am an MD PhD student here at the university. So that means I'm doing both medical school training and I'm just in my final year of my PhD. And actually both of your presentations made me think about things within both of those hats. So talking about the idea of confronting disruption in research, in education, and in medicine. I really started to think about the idea of, what is a university? Sarah, you made a comment really interesting, was that universities are the pinnacle of where research takes place. And I was recently in a pretty heated meeting about where universities are going in Ontario, especially. So as many people probably know here, a lot of the Ontario universities have massive financial deficits. And so a lot of people were discussing, well, is a university a place of higher education or of teaching, training, or is it a business? Are we looking to make money? And so all of that to say, it started to make me think of so I co-authored a chapter in Confluences where I summarized the Lamontagne report of 1967 to 1977, over 50 years ago. And it's a beautifully written report. And what's so interesting is that the issues that we're talking about today, the issues that graduate students face in terms of funding, in terms of brain drain and so on, was explicitly reported 50 years ago. And they talked back then about this idea of, well, their fear of a changing university landscape, moving away from the humanities, the arts, social sciences. And as Tara just mentioned, that seems to be becoming a reality now, which is very unfortunate. They talked also about who should be in charge of science policy, who should be in charge of making these decisions. And they left, and I just will read this briefly, a comment at the end of the report, which is very interesting. This was a Senate committee, by the way. They said that their desire for the House of Commons to eventually decide to become involved systematically in science and policy. So again, back then looking to this idea of who's making these decisions, but they also alluded to the fear of politicization. The idea that with changing governments, different politics will bring different changes to how our country will move forward with science, with education and policy. And one thing that I wanted to talk about really is the role of society. Both of your presentations were really interesting, and I will comment maybe more so from the eyes of a medical student. And so I was recently on Parliament Hill, talking to parliamentarians, advocating for changes in how we spend money for healthcare. And I talked to leaders of different parties, I talked to MPs of different parties. And one of the things that we advocated for was this idea of a pan-Canadian licensure, so that a doctor who trains here in Ontario can work in Quebec, can work in so on and so forth. And the feedback we got from a certain party was that, no, we don't want to overstep on anyone's toes in the provinces. We don't want to give oversight to these, take away control. That was for that specific healthcare issue. But then when it comes to research, the script seems to switch. And the idea of, well, wait a minute, actually, we do want to see what's going on. And so it makes me think again, okay, well, what is happening? And really it is this politicization. And Mark, something that you talk about as well is we just began to start learning about this idea of robot assisted procedures in medicine. And so something that I thought of, and I don't know the answer, and I'm excited to look at it, is you know, what does society think of that? Are they excited about that? Do patients want that? Do doctors want that? I think the answer is yes, I don't know, but I would like to see, are people engaging society enough in those types of decisions? Because it is going to be a reality in the future, as you said, and it does amazing things. One of the final things I'll leave off here, again, because I wear these two different hats, I have a lot of opinions and different things. But I think it speaks to both of your presentations. Some of you may have heard over the last 2 or 3 days, there was a new bill, Bill 83, that came out of Quebec, that is essentially intending to force new doctors who graduate from the Quebec Medical School to stay in public sector for at least 5 years. And if they don't, if they go to the private sector, they're gonna be fined $200,000 a day. And so this is a way that the government of Quebec is trying to force students to stay in a public sector, to have control over that sort of, you know, jurisdiction over governance. And, you know, as you might imagine, people are freaking out about this. Both students, but also the people of Quebec are saying, we don't want this, like, this is an active way to drive our doctors away. And so, again, I know it's not necessarily PhD scientists in general, but the idea of education, of research, and how that meets policy, it really is becoming political every day, at the federal level, the provincial level, and even at our institutional level. I think both of your presentations really fostered that thought in my mind. So thank you so much. Probably went over time, but thank you.
Good, good, thank you, Bryce. All right, good. So lots of topics here. Although I would say that, yeah, there does seem to be kind of a through line around governance and politics at that interface of science, society, and policy. So I want to open things up first to participants online. Do we have any questions that you would like to put to Mark or Sarah? Questions or comments from online? Oh, getting in. And if not, then we'll go to the room. So be thinking of. Here we go. All right, couldn't the examples provided of politicization of science not be argued to be democratic accountability when it comes to the use of taxpayer dollars for science? There are many initiatives to make science relevant for society. Is this not the same thing? If science is going to receive the benefits of taxpayer dollars, doesn't the taxpayer have some say?
Absolutely. I think that's why we need that value proposition. So I think if you talk to anyone in your personal lives now who maybe aren't from the science perspective, I don't think they know how the work that I do in a lab impacts their lives. So like I said, we've lost that narrative, and I think that is exactly why it's become politicized. Even in the standing committee just on Tuesday, one of the Conservative MPs brought up he listed again a few different research projects like they do in every committee, but this time they were international projects. So it was ones that were studying, the one he brought up was at-home care of women in boat top. And he was like, how can I go home to my riding and tell people that this is what taxpayer dollars are funding? Like, tell me why. And I don't think that we as a community have a good answer to that. Like, I don't think that we have the ability to speak their language and explain why. We know, I think intuitively ourselves, what the value of that is. And the witness who was being asked brought up a good point on Canada's international standing, and like, what do we want to say Canada is as a nation? We want to be a nation that can do research on things like this. Like, we want to be like want to go gold kind of thing, like that whole Canada first kind of mentality. But when we're facing significant like affordability crises on a national scale, how can we justify this? I think we have to reflect on that. I think it's really important.
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking. I mean, what I was hearing a little bit was, if we want to advance these innovative, new technologies for the economic benefits that they bring, it would be helpful to simplify the governance of those technologies. How does that jive though with the idea that we are a federation, we have these different levels of like the multi-level governance aspect of it?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So the way I view public robotics is essentially as ungoverned by default. We've made a process for governing these things, which is so long, so convoluted, so many different decision makers, that the answer is not no by default, it's I don't know by default. And so we are inviting non-compliance. That's a problem because maybe people actually do want robots in public spaces. Maybe they want some and not others. We actually really have no idea. If I can tie it to something you were saying, Bryce, like the question of how do people actually react to robots in their day-to-day lives? I would say, one, that it wildly varies depending on what it's for, and two, that we're very bad at predicting people's reaction to any sort of new technological change. If I can give an example from my darling wife, who was in the hospital, she's a psychologist. When COVID ended, the suggestion was, well, you guys are gonna need to come back into the office at least 2 or 3 days a week, because we're estimating maybe 50% of your psychological patients are gonna want in-person service. Actually, it's probably gonna be about 100%, so get ready to come back 5 days a week. Surveyed patients, hey, do you wanna come in for services? 99% said no. And when you think about it, why would they? Like, you have to drive in from far away in the city, you gotta pay $20 for parking, you gotta schlep to the hospital, might encounter somebody who knows that you're getting service versus being comfortable in your own space. But that was not the reaction that was expected. I think right now, most of the reactions to robotics in the public space are driven by, I don't know, but I'm gonna take a quick guess as to how people feel, and so let's do nothing for it. And that is not governance, I would say.
Bryce, maybe you could read the questions, because otherwise I'm speaking to the streets.
Yes, no problem. Can I?
Yeah.
My 2 cents into that?
Sure.
Yeah, and I think one thing that made me think of is this idea that the public, I think, is just getting more and more involved in science and policy. At least anecdotally, that's what I've been seeing. And I think that as a graduate student myself right now, I don't get any formal training on how to engage the public in my research, or how to engage policymakers in my research. And so this idea that, we're training to conduct research, put out our publications, once they're done, move on to the next study and keep recycling this process. That's the model that I think a lot of graduate students find themselves in. And then when we hear, all of these changes in policy, how policymakers think about research, it's difficult, because we should be trying to mobilize what our findings are, engage the public. I made the joke with ISSP recently, my father's a steel worker, my mom is a retired event planner, they have nothing to do with the research. And you might have seen online, a graduate student, ask your parents, tell me what my research is on. Like, can you tell me what I do every day? They had no idea. And maybe that's my fault, maybe I didn't, convey that enough, but that, I think, is a really good reflection of where the society is. They don't know what we do, and they don't know why we're doing it. And a part of the problem is because we don't actually engage with them. And that really might be the model that we find ourselves in the training. We need to teach our students to get more involved. That's my 2 cents, but.
Thanks, Bryce.
So from Mark, the social compact in the past was that money would be invested in university research and benefits would accrue. There's now some skepticism about this equation. What is the value proposition today?
Okay, so, yeah, let me throw out something that you might not expect, Mark. So the social compact that, okay, we invest money into public institutions and then they do stuff and produce benefit that we want. I think it's still fundamentally true, but in 2024, there's a lot of different options. Right, like the only way, it's not that the only way to produce discovery research is through public funding, not the only way to produce new values through public funding or to produce it in public locations. The menu has gotten a lot bigger. And so by consequence, and I'm sure this goes to your comments, by consequence, those in public institutions who are looking to use that traditional model have to go from an environment of no competition to plenty, and need to start being able to advocate why they're a little bit, why they're a useful place to spend themselves.
I'll add to, I recently heard an analogy about the current Trudeau government, and it was saying that this old fable of the man with the pumpkin patch, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of this, and So it was a man and he owned the best pumpkin patch in the city and he thought because he had the best pumpkins that people would come and buy his pumpkins. But he, never went out into the community and told anyone about his pumpkins. And so he just sat there on an opening day, nobody came. And I think that it's an interesting kind of thing because we inherently think if we have value, we have the best product, people will come. But if you don't tell people about it or you don't, it's not visible and people can't see it, then they won't come. And I think we've kind of sat in our silo for a little bit as a science community, and we've sat in our pumpkin patch with the best pumpkins, and we've not really sold that value to society. And I think we've seen, like you're saying, like there's competition now. It's not just us. There's the private sector and there's other countries and things that are competing with us, and so we can't afford to sit there anymore.
Jeff, could you ask Tara what she thinks of that?
Yeah, of course.
Especially of what Sarah just said. Given, I know Tara, given her background, I think she would have an interesting.
Yeah, Tara?
Oh, yeah, no, you're preaching to the choir here. I absolutely think that is one of our most significant challenges, is that we're not connecting the dots. I will take this on as a bit of a criticism of the organization I work for, but one thing that we're working to change and improve. We do, I think, a relatively good job of talking to researchers and certainly funding researchers and making connections between them. We do a reasonably good job of keeping government informed of what research is available and the value of the research and the value of public funding of research. I would say that we're not great at talking to civil society. And so, before I joined SSHRC, I ran the Michael Jean Foundation for a number of years and very much worked in the social justice space. And it was one of the things I continuously kind of hit against is different social justice groups who were making the argument of, we need to make this change because it's right, or we need to make this change because it's 2024. But not necessarily we need to make this change because we have evidence that shows that these are the, ill-intended effects, or here are the consequences of whatever the situation might be. And yet the research exists. So making those connections between researchers, the public, government, and everybody having access to the same information and understanding it in the same way and valuing it in the same way is, I think, one of the big challenges that face us all, and that we're very actively involved in at this time.
So, my title promised you all that I'd talk somewhat about national defense, and I haven't done any of that yet. But there's this great book that came out about 10 years ago by a guy named Moses Nye. It's called The End of Power. And he basically said, I suspect that all brick and mortar institutions that have been the traditional bastions of power and authority are going to be in for a rough ride. That they're going to have trouble sustaining their mandate, their authority, their ability to deliver results for the public and society. Fast forward to, let's say 2022 or maybe today, when defense goes out and tries to actually engage in science and engage in research and development, it's a pretty, it's not a very competitive environment, right? There's only half a dozen defense contractors that are on the blue team that you can sort of go out to. And the traditional process, the one that's been built up over years and generations, has been let's develop requirements, we'll put them out to tender, one of these companies is going to bid, they'll go and try to produce something, it's going to be very incremental. It might take 10 years to develop the requirements and 20 to develop the device, but we're going to still have this monopoly on the use of force because we're the only people who can buy this, right? It's illegal for everybody else to do it. Box checked, defense is bought, and we're able to deliver that for the public. Go to recently, most of the stuff that's being used in Eastern Ukraine is commercial off the shelf and repurposed. No defense contractor involved. And that was a sea change. If you asked 2 or 3 years ago, nobody would tell you that could happen. Throw out a stat or two. The Canadian Armed Forces has probably 50 to 100 drones in inventory. Ukrainian Territorial Defense produces and consumes about 100,000 a month. And their projection for next year is that will triple, assuming that the war continues. Another interesting one. Robotics, including drones, now constitute in Eastern Ukraine about 50% of all fires. So if I can translate that into non-defense language, all things that have been built in the last 100 years are less than 50% of all things that go boom. The other 50% has been invented recently and they're robots. Right, and from non-traditional suppliers. So we're talking about, how do we engage with the public and how do we do things in a different way? Like, this is not just an academic question, figuratively or literally. Like it's very much a disruption that we see across tons of different sectors.
Good. We have another question?
Yes. So is brain drain really a problem? Canada pursues a policy of using immigration to attract the best and the brightest in science. Is this not working? If the people we are attracting are out competing Canadians for work, and those Canadians have to leave, isn't that a success as far as the policy is concerned?
In my very biased opinion, because I've researched on this topic, I have to say that brain drain is a real problem. And again, I think it comes back to that point that I made about, it's really about the permanent outflow of this loss of talent. Like, internationalization is important and it involves creating networks of community, and that's how we internationalize as a country. The permanent loss of our best and brightest is a loss to our country. It's a loss of IP generation, it's a loss of business development, it's a loss of research that even in 10, 20 years might develop into something that is relevant to society. If we look at examples like the Vanier Scholarship in Canada, which was supposed to be a specific targeted scholarship to attract international students to come to Canada and take part in graduate student education. If you look at any report on the Vanier Scholarship by the Tri-Councils, it's totally failed at that objective. That was the reason that the whole award was created. And so, the systems that we've created to actually recruit international talent hasn't been working. So I think in combination with that, with brain drain, like the combination of both, we're both not attracting people to our country, but we're also losing our talent to other countries. And so, we're talking about things being created in Canada and COVID vaccines being able to be created in Canada. Yes, it's a question of private interest as well, but it's also a question of like, are we keeping the people here who will create businesses in Canada and do that here? So that's kind of, I think, where I would go to that. I think the second part there was about kind of competing. Yeah, maybe if someone else wants to comment too.
Well, there's also on the immigration policy issue, there's the question of whether we recognize credentials.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Just a small thought on that one too. So, if we attract the best and brightest from other countries and they come here and become Canadian and then leave.
Yeah.
Is it
Very good.
Yeah.
Is it like, you still call that brain drain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll add from our survey, because 25% of them were international students, almost all of them were gonna leave to go back to their home countries or to the US. Yeah.
Just 2 points. Also, look at where the immigration policy is in the country now, right? So if you're a graduate student here in Canada, first year to fifth, sixth year, wherever you are, and you start hearing what's being said in the media about how our country federally is dealing with immigration and students. I mean, I'm a Canadian citizen, but if I were in that position, I would feel very different than what I do today. And how that would impact my career planning would be enormous. The only other comment I'll make is essentially, we can also look to follow the money, right? So we talk about, these huge federal scholarships, which is phenomenal if you get them. But they're not going to provide funding to everybody. And we can even talk about provincial scholarships. All of these are becoming so competitive. And then if you even look at just the base funding for a graduate student, the University of Toronto recently announced that they were increasing their base to 40,000 per year for graduate students. That was just announced, I think, a couple months ago. It's going to be very interesting to see how that may or may not affect recruitment of students at different schools. In Toronto, are graduate students, new graduate students gonna flock there because they see, well, I'm gonna get paid at least 40 grand? Or are they gonna come here, other schools? I think, for example, my base in my department, I think is 28,000 for a PhD student. That's a big difference, especially today. And so it will also be interesting to see how other schools may or may not
Yeah.
adjust.
Internal competition as
Exactly.
well, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. We've got only a few minutes left. I'd actually like to give Mark and Sarah an opportunity for a final word before we close out the public portion. Well, Mark, do you want to say anything?
Oh, sure, so, maybe I'll do two good things, so. One thing that I hand waved past at the beginning, like, how much robotics are you gonna see? The most credible estimate, the one I find most convincing, is that by mid-2030s, you'll see about 4 billion units in use globally. I find this to be a credible low estimate. If you think about it, right now, about 1 billion cell phones are sold per year. And then another 250 million are like other computer type devices. So to hit that mark of 4 billion units a year, like you really only need maybe 10–15% of existing cell phone sales to be able to move on it. Right, and is that achievable in a decade? Like absolutely, right? Like the revolution in just having cell phones took less than a decade. So if we're talking about 4 billion units, actually like that's what, half, 1 unit for every 2 people. So like my household already has 4 robots, right? Like I'm a bit of a biased sample. I did write a paper on robots. But like it's not, doesn't stretch the imagination too much. If we are getting to those sorts of volumes, like wow, we are wildly unprepared to govern them. The other thing that I'll add is that if we talk about jurisdictions which have simplified to have a single governance authority, which can tell you, yes, this is legal, yes, this is allowed. The biggest, most impressive one in the last 2 years has been defense. By far. These are not things that are designed to bring you coffee. They're not designed to help you deliver groceries or navigation through the airport. They're designed for other purposes. And if we are not figuring out how to govern these things, Pandora's box is already open, and we sort of expect that it will stay in a defense realm, but we could have a security challenge as well. So I think we need to get on it for all the positive reasons, and also because there's a lot of negative ones that we should start trying to avoid.
Good, thanks, Mark.
Writing notes to myself so I don't forget. Bryce, when you think of, we're talking a lot about the value of science and research in society, but what is the value of a graduate student? And I mean, I experienced this doing media outreach to the public. The first question I would get asked is, why are you even funded? Why do you get money? Like, aren't you just a student? And, it would take explaining, what is a graduate student? Why, like, we're basically we have a full-time job doing research and advancing knowledge creation. And that's why we get a stipend to cover this and things like that. But the value of a graduate student or a postdoc to society is equally as important. But the last point I'll make is the value proposition as well. I often hear, and there was just an article in Nature published this week that said, science can solve all of the grand challenges of today and tomorrow, but nobody's listening to them. And, I think we can't overstate the impact that we can have as well. Like, yes, we can have solutions to grand challenges, and we can work for decades or centuries on the grand challenges of today and tomorrow, but we also can't oversell the impact and say, we have all the solutions to the world, nobody's listening to us.
Right.
I think especially on the theme of science advice there, like science advice mechanisms across the world are asking questions to a scientist and getting an answer. It's never really the science community, with this big body of information out there, just wanting to get out and have all these windows of opportunity to expand it to, scientists are asked pointed questions and they're expected to give an answer, and the way that that question is framed to them. And so, I think there's just a distinction to be made there on trust. And I know we talked about that a lot in the last session, but in creating trust and fostering trust with the community, we also have to be realistic about what we actually can do, and be able to talk about certainty in a way that resonates with the public.
All right, great. Thank you all. So a huge thanks to Mark and Sarah, and as well to Tara and Bryce for your comments and perspectives. We will draw this portion of the program to a close. Thank you for all of you who joined us online, and I hope to see you at the future action dialogues in January and February.